So as you can see, the title of this session is The Pattern of the Art World. And we have three speakers, Mitali Banerjee, Ahmed El Gamal, and Burak Arkan. And I'm going to have each of them, their bios posted as we start into their slide presentations. So by way of an introduction, I'm Jeffrey Schnapp. I'm the faculty director of metaLAB. Had the privilege of co-organizing this event with my colleagues from the Barabasi Lab and metaLAB colleagues, of course. And I wanted to start with the question of what we understand by pattern when we talk about the art world. And I'm a literary historian by training, so I can never start any conversation without thinking about the history of words. And the word pattern is a really interesting one because it derives from the word for patron, which is, those of you who speak a Romance language will know, is a word associated with authority, with patrons, with patronage. And it's only over time that it shifts towards this idea of pattern. In fact, there is, in many Romance languages, no real word for pattern. You often use the English word. And that's the first point I want to make. The second point is that shifting uses, if we can trust Google Ngrams, of pattern itself show a close correlation between the rise of electronic media and computation and the interest or kind of thematics of patterns as meaning-bearing or significant for points of argumentation, for research, for the production of knowledge, for cultural communication. So the word pattern already comes freighted with questions of authority and authenticity and reproduction, and at the same time questions of the specificity of the kind of conditions of the contemporary era. So what do patterns mean here? Patterns are, of course, temporally and spatially recursive structures, and they occur, of course, also on multiple scales and in multiple dimensions. Patterns generate patterns. Cultural history is largely a product of patterns, feeding on patterns, generating patterns. They can be retrospectively as well as prospectively predictive, and this predictive dimension is one of the dimensions of our conversation today that's already come up, and I think that's going to come back over the next day as well. But patterns, by their very success at being recognized as such, also generate anomalies, what are perceived as non-patterns, perceptions of randomness, of deviation, or to flip the coin on its head, creativity, innovation, that which diverges from predictable patterning of one kind or another. An additional point is that patterns they signify not in some kind of independent universe, but rather as a function of the context in which they are perceived. And recognition of patterns presupposes certain cognitive affordances, habits, expectations, techniques of analysis, capture, even awareness of representational conventions. And all communicative, social, and economic systems are founded on forms of pattern recognition of one form or another. So when we're talking about the pattern of the art world here, we're talking very broadly about this intersecting domains. So the second term in our title is, of course, art world. The question might be, what are the implications for the world of art that focusing on the question of pattern opens up for us? And I'm just going to mention a few because they're ones that our presenters today are going to be touching upon in their own work. They involve the dynamics of artistic practice from the standpoint of what we would call tradition, in other words, forms of imitation that follow patterns, that use patterns as points of reference, but also, of course, invention, innovation, variation, divergence. Art, in that sense, is a recursive system. Secondly, the social and economic history of art. The study of patterns opens up the opportunity to think on a macro scale, in particular, about collecting institutions, the roles of museums, the roles of auction houses and similar key players in the system of art. The question of evolving standards, of thresholds, expectations, and habits in the realm of aesthetic experience, from individual genres, subgenres of communication, cultural communication, to scaling all the way up to collecting practices, exhibition practices, and the like. And one of the topics that's on the table today, but we'll come back tomorrow, has to do with what might alternative or expanded historiographies of art look like, ones that move together in qualitative and quantitative dimensions that move across the macro to micro scale and back and forth. And in that context, of course, the question of leveraging the power of analytics, of network analysis, of machine learning, AI tools, as well as, of course, the key infrastructures like collections database and provenance indices that allow us to expand the critical compass and the expressive power of new forms of cultural historiography. So these are the kind of broad confines of what we're going to be talking about. I want to just give one example from metaLAB's own practice that is relatively recent. It was a project of putting expert human curators in conversation with different AI tools and machine learning tools, and to try to imagine what a world of expanded curatorial practice might look like that uses data to drive some of the experience design facets of curatorial work. And the example I'm going to give is a project that Dietmar Offenhuber, who spoke earlier today, and I and a small team developed, which tried to ask a question that is fundamental to the history of art. Artworks are often literally about looking, explicitly, the act of observation. So the question was, what would be an interesting way to create an experience of looking at a scale that exceeds the scale that accompanies conventional visits to exhibition spaces and so forth? And in doing so, we thought it would be interesting to try to leverage the power of facial recognition technologies and to apply them to the analysis of the collections of the Harvard Art Museum. So the project in question is called A Flitting Atlas of the Human Gaze. It's a kind of prototype for how one might tell a story at this, in this case, the scale of about 5,000 objects across media, painting, print, photographs, coins, sculptures, et cetera, extracting the landscape data of the position of the head and the apparent directionality of the gaze, and then creating an experience that would allow visitors to do something that you can't do face-to-face with a physical object, which is to navigate such a large corpus of objects, but ideally it would be a corpus of hundreds of thousands or even millions of objects, studying the pitch, roll, and yaw of human subjects portrayed in those objects across media. And this is essentially the visualization that was installed into the gallery, which creates both an aggregate view where you can actually track the gaze of human subjects from left to right, up, down, corner to corner, in the aggregate form, but you can also look at media-specific concentrations of clustering of forms of looking. And I'm just going to quickly show this little video clip where you can see what the interaction looks like. You can go look at it online. It's still installed. This is the aggregate view where you're literally looking at a kind of spherical representation of the distribution of gazes in some 5,000 objects across media. And then you'll see it's going to shift to a media-specific view where you can look at the difference between, to take the most obvious and extreme case, photographs, where the convention of looking directly at the camera is part of a kind of social pact that has become inherent to the medium of photography that we're all familiar with. The idea that photographs are about an exchange between the taker of the photograph and the subject of the photograph, versus coinage, where frontal gazes are almost excluded. They're extraordinarily rare in the whole millennial history of coins. And it was this experience that we wanted to construct as a kind of interactive experience. It's both a kind of experiential innovation, but it's also an attempt to create an expanded framework for forms of research into the history of looking, which is, of course, fundamental to the field of art historical research as well. And that brings me to our first speaker, Metalie Banerjee, who is going to be speaking to us on understanding and valuation of art with AI as a tool and creator. Metalie.